All right, now we're recording.
Now we're recording, okay.
Yes.
Hi, Catherine. Welcome to Winging It.
Hi, Catherine.
And we're excited to talk to you about your work. As Mark was saying before we started, we've been talking to a lot of painters, comic book artists, printers, but no one who works so much with material. So but before we get into all that, I know you have a show coming up online, which is collage, is it? Or maybe you just tell us about it. Is it CMS Art Projects, I believe?
Yes, it's a group called CMS Art Projects that Penelope Stewart started, a year and a half ago.
Okay.
And it is a group mostly of Toronto artists, although I'm in Windsor now. And it's, I guess I should say Ontario based. And the new work is, a series of collages. Originally, I was planning to create a series of works that were related to some of the more technological work I've been doing, but because of COVID-19, I wasn't able to get access to the technology. And I decided it was a good opportunity just to return to doing something that I really love to do and something that's a bit relaxing.
Yeah, and I also noticed that you've been doing some collaborative work with Lila Rye, and that's interesting. Mark and I do a lot of collaborative work, including drawings and stuff. So it's an exciting. Is that included in the CMS work? Or
no, it's separate projects. Okay. Coincidentally, just both working with collage. Okay. When I moved to my new place in December, the previous owners left behind a stack of 1960s magazines, so it gave me lots of fodder to work with.
How do you find the collaborative process? How does that work for you? Do you guys each come up with an individual thing and look for overlap, or does somebody start something and somebody complete something else? How would that play out?
Well, this is actually a project that Lila's doing with a number of artists.
Okay. Right.
So she has a bunch of sketchbooks that she's found that have gridded patterns on them, or patterns, what do you call them? Axiometric markings for drawing in perspective.
Right.
And
cool.
Yeah, so she's invited a number of artists to do this with her, and she sends you a sketchbook with marks on which pages you're to create work on.
Right.
And then you send it back to her, and she sends you sketchbooks that she started. So altogether, I think each artist does 4 sketchbooks, 2 that they start and that she finishes, and 2 that she starts and they finish.
So that sounds somewhat similar to the project Charlie and I are involved in with a friend of ours, Steve McCabe, where we each exchanged partly finished sketchbooks similarly, and just drew in and around what each other did.
Yeah, we had 3 sketchbooks on the go. Very cool.
Yeah.
I love collaborative work.
It was great for guys like us who have very limited attention spans. So I found for myself at any rate, I only have to do this little bit here, and they can then fill in the rest, because I've run out of energy. I'm going to go on to the next page and do something different.
It's actually inspired me to do a similar project with my students next year. We'll be online for the fall, and it occurred to me that doing a mail art project with my first year drawing course might be a great way to get them into doing collaborative work, but also to take the pressure off, to really get them into the process of drawing, rather than the worries that younger students have about work being perfect, and this takes that away.
Especially, I'm going to have to look at Merlin. Is that how you pronounce it? The portrait?
Yes.
That's a work that both Mark and I have watched the video animation, and really intrigued by that. And one of the things we had talked about just before we went online was that it's time-based to create that, and rather than just doing a sketch or two, you really have to have faith and trust in the process, and endurance. Maybe you can talk about that and talk about the whole process it brings into a bunch of things together, the sculpture, the layering, and then the CT scan.
And I should just quickly add a lot of knowledge base in things like medical technology. I think you're the first artist I've encountered who uses barium and CT scanners as part of their oeuvre. So we'd love to hear, I mean, first I want to hear how Merlin was put together, which must be a very complicated and very sophisticated process, but I also want to hear how you became involved in these interesting materials.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you a bit about how I got involved with the materials first, and then segue into talking a bit about the Merlin piece. It really was my dentist who got me started. When I lived in Toronto, Martin Bourgeois was my dentist, and I think he's the dentist for half the artists in Toronto.
Okay.
And he knew that my work has a strong interest in medical history and themes around the body. So when he got a new CT scanner for his practice, he invited me to come and play with it, which of course is irresistible, right, for an artist.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so the first few works I did with him, one of them was evolved into a piece called Grave, which was shown at the art gallery, the University of Waterloo Art Gallery with Nethermind. And just after I finished Grave, I did a studio visit with Melissa Bennett from the Art Gallery of Hamilton, and she said, you know, we're doing this project with St. Joseph's Health Center, collaboration with artists, and if you could have access to any kind of technology, what would it be? And I went, oh, full-size, full-body CT scanner. And that was,
it's like the artist fairy came and, you know,
exactly.
wait for one. Why don't we talk about Merlin, just to be sequential, and that's going to be, there'll be some video from that show and an image of the sculpture.
Yeah. So the Merlin piece actually began many years ago. Back in 2001, I was in Baltimore and saw a embroidered garment that had been made by a woman who was in what at that time would have been called a mental institution. And she was probably an untreated schizophrenic, and she created these just fantastical garments that are embroidered with thread that apparently she shredded. She took old garments from the laundry and turned it into thread and sewed with it. And initially I wrote about the piece back in, I think around 2006. I wrote an article for the Brock Review, and it's always stuck in my mind subsequent to that I wanted to do something with it visually, but it's very hard working with material like that because you want to respond to it, but not to overwhelm it or copy it in any way. So the piece, the title, Portrait of Merlin, is an homage to this woman and to the kind of creativity that happens under such adverse circumstances. When I created the piece, I guess the other impetus for it was I was collecting red work quilts for another project and was ending up with a lot of parts of the quilts that I wasn't using for that project, and a lot of lace that people had given me over the years. So I had the materials, had the access to the CT scanner, and began thinking about what it would be like to imagine the inside of that mind. The work was created by taking an MRI scan that had been anonymized on the internet, and it was a scan of a woman's head. She was in her 60s, I don't, obviously it was anonymized
Sure.
for students. I don't know who it was, but that also fit in nicely with the Merlin story, where we really don't know very much about her. Most of the hospital records have gone, and the very little information we have is primarily what was told to a journalist several years after Merlin had died by a nurse who had worked with her. So I began taking this CT scan and recreating the slices of the scan in lace, painting the lace and the embroideries with different densities of barium to get different shades of white and gray. And then I also embroidered a number of copies of one fragment of an image from the coat, which is of a woman falling, holding a crutch. And in the writing that I did about the piece, one of the things I wrote about was that this, to me, seemed like one of the images that perhaps was her original drawing, where a lot of the images in the coat were clearly taken from found sources, images of comic books like Little Lulu, images of advertising. But somehow this had a very different characteristic to the other.
Personal.
Yes, and it really read as being more personal. So that is that reference to her work within the portrait piece.
Yeah, when you watch the animation in that piece, it's very touching. It's very,
Yes.
It's like you are inside someone's mind, their memory, their, like everything, like, and you're aware of like the life process going on. And yeah, it's very touching, just the way the birds and the figures move and appear and disappear. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing wedding of the technical with the personal and the psychological.
Yeah, I think that's
just see, technical wizardry going on here. There's really a human being that's being revealed through this. Anonymous as she may be, there's a real human being that's being revealed.
Well, and then the head itself, the finished piece looks like petrified wood to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
About those layers and layers of sediment, but the truth of it opens up in the animation. And it really speaks to that idea of like the inner life, of course, of people, but of things, and that things aren't what they seem.
No. And the piece was, to a large extent, a real leap of faith, because it took literally months to create it. And although I did a very short test at the beginning, we really didn't know what it was going to look like until the final scan was done. And yeah, so that was, I mean, hundreds of layers of painting, like in any animation traditionally, but then the output is so non-traditional in that it's CT scanned, and then it's output using medical imaging software.
Well, and then in the installation, you have the head, and then you have the projection, I think, on the wall, right? So it's like seeing the head and what's inside the head lived out. It's quite wonderful, magical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's also a bit perverse. It's taking, when we, as sculptors, we always think about the exterior of the form being the important part.
Right. Yes, that's an interesting exploration, which I know you engrave as well. You created, I think, on the website, it says like you created from the inside out.
Yeah.
You mentioned the red works, and I wanted to talk about that too, because they're quite striking. And I just did like a quick, search about what red work was about, and I suspect you've studied the history of it. Maybe you can tell us what it's about and how that links to your piece, which is quite stunning, and people will see it in this video.
Red work is a traditional embroidery form that began around the middle of the 1800s, when the first permanent dyes became available. And people were just inspired by, having a permanent red dye, so that suddenly you had thread that could be colored and would remain that really intense carmine red. And apparently it originated in Britain, but spread very quickly to the Americas. So these red work quilts feature a number of topics. Most commonly, you'll see very homey images like flowers and animals and domestic scenes.
Yeah.
But then there are also quilts that are quite political, sometimes showing political figures, sometimes showing maps or courthouses.
Probably personal stories, right, from the families, and
Exactly, and often they were signed works as well. So either a quilt that was done as sort of a masterwork by a single person who would sign her quilt.
That's interesting. Is that unique in quilting?
Pardon me?
Is that unique in quilting? Because I think of it often as being anonymous. Quilting.
Often quilts are anonymous. In this case, frequently they're signed. Sometimes they're also made as community quilts, where each block is made by a different person and that block is signed. Or names are included on them as a fundraiser, where you would pay a certain amount of money to have your name added to the community's quilt. And the more you paid, the bigger your name was.
I think they still do that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I was intrigued by the political aspects of the quilt, and by the way that images were being taken from one context, such as a newspaper or an advertisement, and then transformed into an image on the quilt. So I began inserting images of first Abu Ghraib and then other political imagery into embroideries and sewing them into curtains. The first version of the piece was done for a show called Puppet Act that was at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. It was curated by Linda Jansma. After I guess when I made it, I had originally hoped it would be 3 panels, but very labor-intensive process. I ran out of time. It was 2 panels. And then I thought, well, why not just make it like bigger? So now I'm working on a very large version of the piece that has a community aspect where people are invited to contribute squares to the piece.
Right. Have you been doing workshops or something? Because I think I've seen photos from workshops, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's been on hiatus for about 6 months, just because I've just moved to a new community. But it is something I'm going to come back to. At this point, I'm not sure when this piece will be done. I think we're looking still at a good 3 years before it's finished.
Yeah. So on your website, there's a piece with those curtains, but you've got the skeletons, the red skeletons with embroidery on them, and that's quite striking. And of course,
yes.
I love skeletons, so I'm really, that really can.
And that seems to combine your interest with the body, and again, medical history, history of science, with in this case, very current events and current political events, or recent current political events.
There does feel like there's a really natural connection between both sewing and the body and quilts and the body. Mm-hmm. Sewing being that very labor-intensive activity that requires the hand and the eye. And the quilt, of course, because it is something that's very intimate that you sleep with.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And somehow that act of putting those images that are so embedded in our psyche into the quilt, and both having the experience of the meditation of making an embroidery of an image like Kent State, or an image of the Vietnam War or Abu Ghraib, but also then the embrace of that image with the potential that if you were to use these things as a quilt, that you would be physically helped.
If I had to use them as quilts, I'd probably have nightmares because of
well, I am actually doing some adjacent pieces that are embroidering the Abu Ghraib images and images of Vietnam back into actual quilts. Probably they won't be used for sleeping, but you never know. I would love if someone had one and actually used it as bedding. But
before
if you did a CT scan piece of the interior of my brain, the kinds of images that would be projected would not just include Abu Ghraib and political scenes like that, but a whole lot of other disturbing things.
Yeah. So I was telling Mark before we talked to you that this phrase came to me, that your work was about the history of trauma and the trauma of history.
That's a beautiful way of describing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea of the trauma of history is I love that phrase that you've used, because it really acknowledges that even for events that we haven't experienced personally, we can experience history as a site of trauma, I think particularly through the imagination. A lot of the time when I'm working, I'm listening to books on tape, because I do so much handwork that's very labor intensive. And primarily I listen to nonfiction, and most of it is about history. Currently I'm listening to another book about World War II, listen to a lot of works about the history of that war from different perspectives, and as well listening now to a lot of books about what the US is experiencing right now, and feeling like we are going through a really monumental moment in history that we will look back on, and a moment that I think is going to be even more significant than what we experienced in 2001 with the bombing of the Twin Towers. Well, I think one of the questions that we talked about in advance was, why make work about themes like this?
Yes.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge that those things happened, and not only to acknowledge them, but to reinterpret them in a way that isn't only horrifying. That with the work that I do, I don't know that I initially was doing this intentionally, but have somehow hit on this balance that's between images of the horrific, but by making them in a way that's very craft oriented and very highly crafted and delicately made, and made out of materials that are associated with the home or with things that are beautiful.
Caring, beauty, yeah.
That it I don't know quite what it does to those images, but it somehow, it doesn't make them palatable, but it makes us think about them in a different way, or maybe makes it bearable to look.
It's almost like the idea of bringing compassion to the trauma of history, or the history of trauma. You're bringing loving care and attention and a sense of beauty to it.
Yeah, compassion is a good word to use. So maybe empathy as well. I want the
Yes, yeah.
viewer to feel empathy more than they feel horror.
Mm.
But I think
Makes it
by
personal history, personalizing history.
mm-hmm,
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I would think curiosity also plays a part in the element, is an element in your work, particularly for the viewer. I think if you look at, you know, if you just look at something at face value, oh, she's done a sculpture of some heads connected, Siamese Siamese connections, twin connections like that, deformed faces and bodies. Of course, one could immediately think, "Oh dear, what's going on here?" But if you have an element of curiosity about you, you're going to try to learn more about what is she trying to express here? What is she saying? And then as you do, you realize, oh, there's a lot of thought going on here. There's an awful lot of sophisticated thought. Again, you know, and your use of non-traditional and traditional materials helps invite that kind of curiosity as well. I mean, once one actually sits down and realizes, oh my God, this must have taken, you know, months, if not years, to put this installation together, you realize how layered each of your conceptualizations are. Catherine, I wanted to ask you a little bit about one of your more recent projects. Forgive me if I mispronounce it. Micrographia
Oh yeah.
or micrographia?
micrographia.
Graphia, okay. Which again combines an interest in the scientific, in this case, microscopy or microscopy, with history, a 17th century text about micrographia, such somewhat traditional materials like Japanese papers and somewhat non-traditional materials like plant materials from your garden, stems and seeds, and our old friend, the CT scanner.
Yes.
So,
Right. And now those are
I
ones
do
that were
share with
shown.
you. Sorry,
Those
go
ones
ahead.
that are shown in the bell jars.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. So that's awesome too. Adding that.
It's absolutely amazing as an installation. And I do share with you a great interest in micro worlds, the great and the very tiny. In my case, I think I would be more interested, more leaning, well, somewhat with microbiology, but definitely with quantum space and quantum levels of
Subatomic.
space. You know, the very idea, for example, yes, the subatomic, the idea that two particles within an atom, the space between two particles within an atom is about has a macro equivalency of, say, the would stretch from one side of our solar system to another. If you just blew up, so essentially we're made of empty space. That's the idea that intrigues me. Forget what everybody says, we're all water. No, we're all empty space. The existentialist in me just is driven wild by such ideas. But
as are
your installation,
as are the Buddhists, right?
Yes, and the Buddhists. Yes, I mean the
The
existentialists
void,
and the Buddhists.
Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, but we won't go into Heart Sutra.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, Sartre was right. Being is nothingness. but in terms of micrographia, can you walk us a little bit through that process? And again, we're featuring our friendly CT scanners and such. But what an amazing and very interesting installation. I'd really like to hear how you assembled that from the conceptual standpoint, and then eventually into the actual installation.
Well, so often in these situations, it's the availability of certain types of technology that shape what the installation becomes. After I finished the work that I did with the Art Gallery of Hamilton and St. Joseph's Health Centre, I didn't have access, of course, anymore to the full-size CT scanner. And I began asking around Toronto to see if there was anyone I could work with there. And, you know, it's amazing what happens when you start asking people. You know, you start putting out those feelers and eventually something clicks. A colleague at OCAD suggested that I talk to the STAR Lab, and I got in touch with them. They were wonderful. They were really interested in what I was doing and happy to have me come in and you know, slip a few pieces into the scanner. But their scanner turned out to be a micro CT scanner.
Oh.
So it's basically designed, they do cancer research, basically designed to scan rats.
Okay.
So it's this tiny little scanner,
Yeah.
but it scans at a really high resolution compared to the scanners that we use or that are used for the body. And it just opened up this whole other world of possibilities that suddenly I could, instead of making large things, make very, very tiny things. And I began thinking about, you know, what materials work with that. Simultaneously, I've been looking at some images by Ernst Haeckel, who did beautiful, beautiful drawings in the mid-1800s of radiolarians, which are those little microscopic organisms in the ocean that essentially have a sort of skeletal structure within them. I'm terrible at describing these things.
Exoskeleton, or is it?
Actually, I'm not entirely clear. They leave behind, you know, these trace skeletons that are smaller than grains of sand. Wow. And during the Victorian era, scientists were fascinated by these things. And of course, microscopes had evolved over, you know, the 150 years or so since Hooke wrote Micrographia. You were able to get even better images now, images that were enlarging things more. And people would take these tiny little radiolarians and they would arrange them geometrically on microscope slides to create these beautiful patterns.
You're making art.
Yeah, and similarly, Haeckel's images, you know, he arranges them in symmetrical patterns on the page. And I was just so intrigued by those images, and also thinking about the synergies between things in the universe of different sizes. As you were talking about earlier, the the atoms and the spaces between them, thinking about how those microscopic things look similar to things in the real world. And of course, the garden being one of those places where I spend a lot of time. And, you know, I had begun collecting things like poppy seed, or poppy, not the seeds, but the seed pods for poppies. Things that have these really beautiful structures. And then somehow began thinking, yeah, I could put these together. And in this case, rather than using barium, I began using a medieval ink that has an iron base that the CT scanner is able to read as well.
Wow, wow. So that kind of thing about, you know, it's like sandwiching time, like taking, you know, these things from a couple hundred years ago and then using modern technology, contemporary technology. It's amazing. Yeah, it's,
and of course, those were the miraculous technologies of their own time.
That was advanced.
So there is this lovely parallel.
Well, and there was I get a sense that there was a more of a sense of design and art to their presentation. As if you looked at a medical journal today, there's going to be no interest, you know, concern whatsoever of how it looks aesthetically. It's just, this is information. Whereas back then it seems like it was information, but it was presented in creative, like there's a sense of aesthetic to it.
Yeah, although I would maybe disagree with, I think the aesthetic has changed in medical books, but I think there is still an aesthetic concern there, especially when we consider that the images that we're looking at in those books are highly mediated. Certainly one of the things I learned from working with the CT scans is how differently these images can be output using the software. And also that, of course, what you're outputting with the software is only ever meant to be seen on a digital screen. So if you actually wanted to print that image in a book, you have to recreate it in another way. But I know what you're saying, in that the older images, the aesthetic overwhelms the information, I think. The aesthetic becomes equally important to the
you can look at them. You could go and look at those just as art and not really care about the scientific information. Whereas nowadays you would be interested in the data about it as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, whenever I talk to artists, I like to ask them about who their influences are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, first person that comes to mind for me is someone like Louise Bourgeois, but I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, sort of like the interest in the body, and I don't. Anyway, I'm curious to know who inspires you.
Yeah, Bourgeois absolutely is one of the artists who I absolutely love. And strangely enough, the new collages, I've been thinking a lot about L. Lissitzky and about the Russian constructivists.
I could see that in those, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But a lot of my influences are from the medical world, and are, I've spent a lot of time in the Fisher Rare Books Library at U of T looking at those old medical books. And so a lot of the things that are influencing me are maybe on the edges of what we consider to be art, whether they are embroidery or whether they're medical drawings or things that were made for other purposes.
Right. Do you have a background in science or medical science?
Not at all, no. Strangely, I have a sister who's a scientist, who's also very artistic, so it's like we're flip sides of each other. My youngest sister and I.
Too bad you weren't twins, right? That would have been. You can always construct that mythology. So what's coming up next besides the collage? And I know you're teaching in Windsor now.
Yeah,
you have
it's
any-
a good question. As I said, I do have a piece. It's called Little Man that has been scanned, but I've never turned into a piece. So that's been pressing on me. I'm also thinking of doing some work reinterpreting the Radiolarians pieces as screensavers for computers. I recently found a program that allows you to create screensavers and then distribute them. So I'm thinking about that. But the other thing that's really weighing on my mind a little bit is that I really do need to get back to the red work piece. And so.
Right.
That's
although I
like
think a lot of my
working
summer,
with. That's like where you're doing the workshops with people and kind of becoming a community. Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah, although I think a lot of this summer is actually going to be eaten up creating materials for the online courses in the fall. But
yeah, that's a whole new way of thinking, eh?
It is.
New way of teaching.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think it will be. I'm actually excited about it. I've got a rig set up so I can start doing some filming from directly above, which will allow me to film demonstrations for the students. But I need to get a head start on that and get going with it, because I know it's going to take a lot of time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything about your work that we haven't asked you about that you would like to just share? Something that you feel that's just
that's a good question.
What you do, or I mean,
yeah. I guess one of the things that I've thought about, and maybe you've had such a wonderful way of putting thoughts into words during this discussion. I'll see if you can help me put this into the words that I need. One of the things I think that's really plagued me over the years is that I work in so many different media, and sometimes I feel a little bit odd about it, you know, that I'm simultaneously working on 3 different streams of work right now, where, you know, some of it is collage that's referencing modernist works. Some of it is this very technological work using CT scanners. And then some of it is handwork with embroidery that's a very community-based project. And it feels very strange sometimes, because I'm not sure how these things fit together.
And when people ask you, what do you do?
Yes.
Mark and I both have the experience of having multiple projects.
It comes from being a Renaissance person.
So I haven't.
You're a Renaissance person. You're working with multimedia, multiple.
When people ask me what I'm doing,
go ahead.
I tell them I'm wrestling a 7-headed beast.
That's what it feels like.
You know, that's it. And, you know, that's kind of a mythological reference. But that's what it feels like, because it's all these different branches. There is a core body, but there's all kinds of different heads going in different directions.
It's also, it's kind of the quilting. Quilting might be a useful metaphor here as well, because you're bringing together, threading together. There are common threads, but you're bringing together maybe disparate, you know, squares and images and materials into one common, you know, artistic quilt, microcosm or cosmos, maybe a big cosmos.
And that's what's so exciting about your work, Catherine, is how you work with a lot of different material.
Yes.
And different types of material, and these different, the material and non-material with the CT scans and the digital and the animation.
Yes.
So some time-based, some, you know, very physical, some microscopic. So yeah,
I have to say that
multi-level or multi-dimensional even.
Mm-hmm. The time-based was really a surprise to me. I never thought I would be doing video work. I never would have predicted it in a
Right.
million years.
That's right.
But even your video work goes in directions that are unique and very, very different from what a lot of it goes into territory that a lot of video does not.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's amazing. It's so awe-inspiring. Catherine, I want to just say, you know, I find I've always held this kind of belief, and maybe I've debated a bit with scientist friends about this, that there is some kind of the extent to which art informs science, and we kind of talked in and about this a little bit tonight, but just to give some examples, scientists, physicists will often talk about the beauty of an equation, or mathematicians, the beauty of an equation, the continuous quest for symmetry, and the role of symmetry in physicists' attempts to understand the universe. These are all aesthetic ideas to me as an artist. And, but it's also, as a non-scientist, it's very hard for me to articulate what the sense that I have that there is some kind of a joining of art and science in the way the universe works. But now I can say, if I can't put it into words, just go look at Catherine's works. And that will exemplify very much what I'm trying to get at.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, thank you, Catherine, so much for chatting with us. And yeah, I look forward to checking out your collages online and
Yes,
following all the many the many fibers and many threads of your work.
Thank you. As always with a good interview, a good discussion, I learn a lot through the discussion with you, and I really appreciate the thoughtful lens that you let me see the work through.
no,
Wonderful. Yeah, it is. It's my favorite part of making art is being in the gallery and talking to people and reflections, and you do it's an opportunity to crystallize your thoughts and ideas about something. We're glad we can help.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Well,
All
this
the
was
best,
very,
Ed.
very exciting.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Be safe. Take care.